Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Rachel Spence, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at MOHI. So thank you for being here from IndyMedia to citizen journalism, media, democracy, and Seattle WTO protest legacy. MOHI is very honored tonight to be partnering with the Moving Image Preservation of Puget Sound and Labor Archives of Washington through the UW libraries. If you have not gotten a chance to check out both of their tables, please come over here after the program and you'll be hearing a lot from them. And I hope that all of you got a chance to go up to the exhibit to see Turtles and Beyond, Teamsters Turtles and Beyond, the legacy of the Seattle WTO protests. This exhibit will be up until April 27th, so if you didn't get a chance, you can come back. As an important orientation to our space, the bathrooms are past this tower, down the hallway on the left. There is also sandwiches, courtesy of the UW Labor Archives, thank you, and other snacks, and there's a bar if you wish to purchase any drinks. And feel free, as you are enjoying this program, to get up and move around, and there's space to stand in the back. We want you to be as comfortable as possible. If you have any questions, find somebody with a MOHI badge. And as we're grounding in space tonight, it's important to acknowledge that MOHI is on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcefully removed from this place, with lasting impacts on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's important and critical that we hold deep respect, gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. So tonight, we're going to be thinking about the WTO through the lens of media and preservation, and how do we remember important events. And to kick everything off, I am so happy to welcome up our keynote speaker, Jill Freidberg, to tell you more.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. I see a lot of people here who were part of the IndyMedia movement, and I also see a lot of people here whose footage is in the archive that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'm glad you could be here as well. The independent media movement, or specifically the IndyMedia movement, had roots, and I think that we should start there. In early 1997, there was a teach-in called Freeing the Media in New York City, and from the jungles of Chiapas, Zapatista Subcomandante Marcos sent a videotaped message to that teach-in, and I have a short excerpt from that to share.
Nos encontramos con un sistema mundial, ahora sí, de globalización que está dispuesto a sacrificar a millones de seres humanos. En este sentido, los grandes medios de comunicación parece empeñada en buena parte en tratar de presentar un mundo virtual creado a la imagen y semejanza de lo que el proceso de globalización requiere, ¿no? En ese sentido, el mundo de la noticia moderna solo es el mundo de lo que le acontece a la gente importante, a los VIPs, a los very important people, pero el común de la gente solo aparece en los medios de comunicación en el momento en que mata o en el que es muerto. Nosotros podemos tener una actitud cínica frente a los medios de comunicación, aceptar que eso es así, que no se puede hacer nada. Otra actitud que podemos asumir es simplemente la incredulidad, decir todo lo que digan los medios de comunicación de los grandes monopolios es mentira, no nos interesa, y conformarnos con la vida doméstica que tenemos. Hay una tercera opción, que no es ni el conformismo ni el escepticismo, que es tratar de construir otra forma de dar a conocer al mundo lo que ocurre en sus diferentes partes. El problema no es solo saber qué ocurre en una parte del mundo, sino entenderlo y sacar las lecciones que deben darnos, como si estuviéramos estudiando historia, pero no una historia pasada, sino lo que está ocurriendo en estos momentos en cualquier parte del mundo. Es una forma de aprender qué somos y qué es lo que queremos y qué es lo que podemos ser y qué nos puede ocurrir si hacemos una cosa o si hacemos otra. El papel de los medios de comunicación independientes, es decir, que no responden a los intereses de los grandes monopolios. Dar a conocer lo que ocurre, se convierten en un nudo de resistencia en contra de la mentira, en una posibilidad de guardar la verdad, mantenerla y difundirla, un poco a la imagen del libro de Fahrenheit 451, donde un grupo de gente se dedica a aprenderse los libros de memoria para que no, si los destruye, no se pierdan. Igual los medios de comunicación independiente tratan de guardar la historia presente, cuidarla y tratar de difundirla y que no desaparezca de la mejor forma que se puede hacer, que es difundiéndola en otras partes. Esperamos que su reunión tenga éxito y que se pueda concretar en acuerdos de esta red, de este intercambio, de este apoyo mutuo que debe haber entre trabajadores de la cultura y de los medios de información que trabajan de forma independiente. I don't know if my English is okay, but good luck and so long. Good.
So, who was at this Freeing the Media teach-in in New York in 1997? It was mostly independent media practitioners and activists who had been working with analog media, broadcast media, and print media for decades. The internet was new and it was clunky, but it also offered a lot of possibility from the standpoint of independent media practitioners and activists. The Zapatistas were the first social movement in the world to use the internet as a strategic and tactical movement building tool. So for these folks in New York to receive this message that was basically, your job is to create a global independent media movement, and to receive that from the first movement in the world to really use the internet towards that purpose was really impactful. So fast forward a couple years, almost exactly a couple years, early 1999, and people were starting to organize around the arrival of the WTO ministerial in Seattle in late 99, and by that time there was already well underway a conversation about using the internet as an independent media tool and about bringing independent media practitioners and activists together at the WTO protests. And almost everyone who was involved in some way in the physical space of the Independent Media Center during the WTO protests and or during the launching of the independent media, IndyMedia.org web platform, had been at that teach-in in New York City, including people from Seattle. I wasn't there, but a lot of people were. And so what were these independent media practitioners and activists so concerned about? Well, at the general level, they were concerned about a rapid consolidation of the media. What did I do with my notes? An increasingly uninformed public, dependent on a shrinking number of media outlets, owned by an increasingly wealthy group of people who had a lot of political and personal interests wrapped up in the media that they owned. And that was starting to look like rural communities no longer having newspapers in their town, towns with with no locally staffed radio stations, just recycling playlists from computer-generated playlists from corporate headquarters on the other side of the country. This process had started, or really, the decline really started in the 80s under Ronnie, when he threw out the Fairness Doctrine and also passed a lot of legislation loosening regulations on who could own what media, where, and how much of it. And then Bill sealed the deal with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I'm referring to them with their first name because a lot of people insisted on doing that with the other presidential candidate we had a choice for last year. So Bill and Ronnie really sort of set this process in motion. And by 2015, 90% of US media was owned by 6 corporations, whereas it had been 50 corporations in 1983. So that's one thing that these independent media practitioners and activists were worried about. Why can't I get my little... Since 2015, of course, that has sort of all been blown wide open and things have blown up and makes the head spin. But suffice it to say that now it is the tech and social media companies that own the most, but it's still a small handful of richy riches. And I think we know who some of those people are. I'm not going to mention them. But then more specifically in relationship to the imminent WTO protests in 1999, these folks who were organizing specifically around independent media had a pretty clear understanding of what the media coverage of the WTO protests was going to look like. And it was going to be protesters who don't know what they're protesting, protesters who are violent, the city as victim, and zero inquiry into why tens of thousands of people from all over the world were coming to Seattle to try to shut the city down, and also zero inquiry into the police response that week. And they were right, that is exactly what happened that week with the mainstream media. So, just as Marcos said in his 1997 address, it was the role of independent media to counter those narratives. And 2 tasks unfolded in the organizing and the lead up to the WTO protests. One was to create a physical space where independent journalists coming to town to cover the protests could do their work, connect with other independent journalists, have the infrastructure that they needed. And the other task was to create a web platform to which people could independently, all by themselves, share their coverage and analysis, text, photo, video, audio. This was effectively the first self-publishing use of the internet, with the exception of some early blogs that required knowledge of coding skills. It really was, there was no YouTube, there was no social media. You could not just get on the internet and put your stuff on it, which conceptually I think is hard at this point, but this was sort of the first opportunity. So that was the other task at hand, was to create that in time for the WTO protests. And they did. An international group of hackers had been working to create this platform, and they launched it on November 30th, 1999, which was the first full day of protests. There had been stuff leading up to it, but the first full day of protests, they launched IndyMedia.org, and this was the first post. The resistance is global. The web dramatically alters the balance between multinational and activist media. With just a bit of coding and some cheap equipment, we can set up a live, automated website that rivals the corporates. Prepare to be swamped by the tide of activist media makers on the ground in Seattle and around the world, telling the real story behind the World Trade Organization. So we had acquired a 2,700-foot space at 3rd and Union, next door to Bruno's Pizza, if anybody remembers that. It was a space owned by the Low Income Housing Institute, and opened up for the week of the protests. We issued 450 press passes to independent journalists coming into the space, and IndyMedia.org was received more than 1.5 million individual hits or visits during that week, more than CNN did. But also there was this use around the world of analog and broadcast and print media that activated to amplify what was going up on IndyMedia.org. So we had a newspaper that we printed each day of the 5 days of the protests, and a collective in Brussels printed that out, made 8,000 copies, and then took them to events and distributed them that way. We had an audio feed of people reporting from the streets of Seattle and also interviews, and that audio feed was, among other things, broadcast across Cuba by Radio Havana, that just pulled the stream off IndyMedia.org and shared it with the entire country of Cuba. So we also had a satellite feed, a video broadcast that went up every night, edited from footage that people just dropped off at the Independent Media Center. Hundreds of people came by and dropped off their footage. So that was the merging of the physical structure and the internet possibility. Probably safe to assume that the Zapatistas were listening to. I hope they were satisfied. But then this thing happened that it was sort of simultaneously exactly what the plan had always been, but also a thing that nobody saw coming, which was immediately following the WTO protests, independent media centers started popping up all over the world connected to IndyMedia.org. And within 10 months, there were 33 independent media centers in 10 countries. And by 2004, there were 142 independent media centers on every continent except Antarctica, although I feel like maybe in the Q&A, I feel like something happened at some point on Antarctica that somebody here might know about. But some of those independent media centers only existed for a specific event, and some of them still exist. The Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center bought the old post office and continues to run a training and radio station and a whole sort of independent media organization out of that space. Some of the independent media centers in Brazil still exist, do a lot of training. So all of the independent media centers provided training, they created radio stations, they did a really great job of amplifying local struggles on a global level. So like, let's say there was a social movement that occupied a bunch of radio stations and also streamed their broadcast, and there were independent media centers around the world pulling those streams off the internet and then broadcasting them on their radio stations, pirate, independent, or otherwise. And then these independent media centers also serve this really important role as in a physical network, which was for independent journalists and media makers who traveled to cover movements or whatever. That they provided physical infrastructure, that you could land in a place and go find the local independent media center and know that you were more or less finding your people, that they would hook you up with a place to, charge your equipment or upload your reports or sleep, or they would tell you who to trust and who not to trust. So it was this really important physical infrastructure of like-minded people who are all plugged in to this independent media network through this IndyMedia.org. So this is a picture of the Brazil, Barcelona, Nigeria, and Washington, D.C. IndyMedia pages. But those are 4 out of the 142, so can't put them all up there. So by 2015, most of the independent media centers were no longer active. There were a few contributing factors. Turns out that self-publishing doesn't always bring out the best in people, so that was a big challenge, just sort of moderating a thing that was supposed to be, wide open. A lot of the organizing of the entire network was volunteer, unsustainable, but also social media made it so that people had a lot of options to sort of curate their own version of what they wanted to tell the world. So those are some of the factors, but it did become a global movement, and from its earliest beginnings, it was pushing back against this corporatization and conglomeration of the media, because that media movement understood what happens when people don't have access to a diversity of voices and perspectives. And what happens when people don't have access to a diversity of voices and perspectives is what's happening now. That a lot of the media activists involved at that time, and prior to that, the paper tigers and deep dish TVs that went back long, long before IndyMedia understood what it might look like if a small handful of very rich and powerful people owned all of the information distribution systems, and if entire communities were sort of cut off from anything other than that. So there were some fears afoot then that we might end up where we have ended up. But I do think that, looking back at that, there are some things we can learn in terms of maybe reclaiming some of those earlier tools that we abandoned as soon as we had the internet in our pocket. We can organize through snail mail. I personally am a big fan of snail mail, and I plan to start using mail art to get some things going, and I'm pretty sure, knock on wood, that nobody's looking in my mailbox yet. But we can do zines, we can do small newspapers, we can create more low-power FM radio stations, we can go back to pirate radio, and we can look to the archives, which is why we are here tonight, to discuss this video collection that at the end of the 5 days of the WTO protests, there was about somewhere around 400 hours of video footage that all of these people that just came through the door and dropped off their tapes contributed, and that the collectives that were collaborating during that week went out and filmed. And all of those tapes, they were tapes, ended up under my stairs for 20 years, and until 2019, when a bunch of people here today started working to digitize and catalog and preserve and make available all of that footage. And that's what we're going to be talking about here in a minute, but I wanted to show you some little teasers. I mean, if you saw the exhibit, then you saw some of it already, but let me see if I can't.
The Battle of Seattle, with the World Trade Organization summit gearing up, thousands prepare to shut the city down. All that and more coming up on Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! On Saturday, among the first people to get arrested were two protesters, two young women, who unfurled a banner as they rappelled down to the highway. At least 150 supporters chanted and cheered during the action near the Denny Way overpass. They were led by a mock cheerleading squad of about half a dozen men and women who wore lipstick and red skirts and called themselves the Radical Cheerleaders. Democracy Now! Was there.
From ropes that are anchored up here. They're hanging a banner on this freeway.
Here, come on.
This is her mother. This is her mother.
That's all right. You have to get back. Well, you can start leaving now, but she can't stay.
I'm right here.
want anybody attempting to enter or give supplies. They're in the middle of legal negotiations and they've just drafted a document that they're all reviewing, and it's really important for the next few hours to really just respect the space.
Jordan's going to kick some words for us. She's going to give some poems. So let's give it a warm welcome to Jordan.
Wake up. Nightmaring on the streets of America, palsied children born clinging to the words, give us you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, are wresting warmth from boxes on November sidewalks. Outside the dinge of a corner office, holiday activists, cloaked in the fashionable words and remains of last month's laundry, are standing in someone's house, standing in everyone's no place to live, crying for the freedom of others whose lean-to shanty lives bleed like bitten tongues hanging from their mouths by strands of mediocrity.
Ask it, why are you here tonight, or what kind of stuff were you into about what was going on?
Well, I'm a poet who opposes the system and all these mental prisons that I see surrounding me, so I illustrate my feelings through words, and that's what I just did in front of a crowd of many. Although I don't believe people are going to be able to shut down the whole World Trade Organization in the period of 1 week, because I don't think people in the city or as a whole are ready for that. But it's raising a lot of consciousness, and I've been seeing it go on for the last month around Seattle. People have been preparing for the WTO.
Wow, look at that. I want one of those. What is it? Is it digital?
Yeah, it's digital mini disc. You can actually rearrange the tracks and edit on it.
Whoa. What I have. The 1995 special. This is Radio Shack. All right.
The station manager of KOMO issued a report on the air, and it also put it up on their website, saying that they will not be covering demonstrations or protests or any type of assembly of groups that have not received a legal permit from the city. What's your comment on that?
I think that's a very dangerous precedent where you have the government working with the media to eliminate access to the public through the media. You really have a collusion behind, in this case, pretty blatantly, corporate power and the government.
Most of the citizens in our country are saying, wait a minute, permit us to be a little skeptical that all of this is going to work out for us and our children. We want to make sure that we earn a decent living, and we're for people in other nations earning a decent living, but we don't like the feel of this right now.
We're here to educate people about what WTO is and what it is not. What you have is a faceless government who's making international decisions to determine what the workplace is going to be about, what trade is going to be about, and they right now are making decisions in favor of the multinational corporations, and the little people are getting left on the cutting room floor.
Don't stop until we keep going. Don't stop. We gotta
Do not run!
We are committed to non-violence!
We are committed to non-violence!
And we shut down the WTO today!
You have it on a floppy? Yeah.
I saw that. Back, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. What are you up to?
We are going to the docks to talk to the rank and file longshoremen and the vice president of the Longshoremen's Union to talk to them about the impact of imports and possible decisions by the WTO on their jobs and their lives and the community.
We'll find out in a second.
While we wait, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on here?
Well, at the moment, we've got, what you got?
Do you know where Media 4 is?
Media 4 is waiting for Media 3 right now. Are you Media 3? So you're looking for Media 4? Yeah. Okay, let's find her.
Oh, that's Media 4.
Okay. Media 4. Media 3 is here at Dispatch. Can you please ring Dispatch Media 4? Media 3 is waiting for you. Over.
Hey, it's Phil. Sorry to call you home. We were just in a discussion at the dance center. There's been some...
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
So that's just 9 minutes out of 400 hours. So the brilliant folks that have helped save this collection are going to talk now, right? Yeah.
Hey y'all, I get the fun part where I get to just thank everybody and then announce the launch of a project. So good evening everyone, siblings, union members, community, family. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to MOHI for hosting us, to Rachel and Sora for their incredible work in making this event possible. And it's always a joy to see so many friendly, familiar faces in the room. For those of you I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Connor, and I'm deeply honored to serve as a labor archivist and head of the Labor Archives of Washington at the University of Washington Library Special Collections in Seattle. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and make accessible records that document the history of working people and their unions in the Pacific Northwest from the 1880s to the present day. The Labor Archives is located at the University of Washington Seattle Special Collections. We're free and open to the public, and you can access the guides to all of our collections online. You can schedule remote research appointments. You can visit us in person to explore the materials firsthand. The Labor Archives was established 14 years ago through a collaboration between the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies at the University of Washington and the University of Washington Library Special Collections. This initiative was made possible by the generous support of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, Longshore Division, the Washington State Labor Council, numerous other labor unions, labor history organizations, and countless individuals. We are also fortunate to have a dedicated advisory board and a Friends of the Labor Archives whose contributions have helped fund events like tonight's gathering and the sandwiches. And of course, we are always grateful for donations that allow us to continue our important work. That same group of people advocated, and it led to state funding and a budget that allowed us to fund the final phase of this multi-year project that was already underway before we were able to help bring it to the final push. And it's going to result in the creation of a web archive, which I'll talk to you about in a second, where you can access many of the hundreds of hours of footage that Jill was alluding to and that she just screened. I want to take a moment to thank a few key individuals who have made tonight's event possible. Jim Gregory, who's the exhibit curator and the professor of history at University of Washington, for the wonderful exhibit tour that he delivered earlier today. Jill Freidberg, of course, who not only for her inspiring keynote, but also for her role as a creator and driving force behind the WTO Footage Digitization Project. Libby Hopfauf and the team at MEPOPs for their incredible work on the digitization project, which Libby will discuss in more detail shortly. I'd like to acknowledge Julie Tanaka, who's our Associate Dean of Distinctive Collections, who came here tonight to support us. My colleagues at the University of Washington, including Hannah Palin, film archivist emerita, and Ann Lally, digital collections curator, who played vital roles in the digitization efforts. Absolutely key was Hannah's work to obtain funding and to have planning and to have the subject expertise to be able to drive this project forward over multiple years. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge my Labor Archives team members, Eulalie Matthew and Ernie Dornfeld, for their unwavering support and all the wonderful work they do to make our collections accessible and preserved. And one of the things we're going to do in a sec is hear from Libby and talk about all the work they did in relation to digitizing these videos and making them accessible. And also we'll do a panel where we'll talk about that work. And the reason why I think that's really important is oftentimes we get, as the researchers or the public, get to benefit from getting to see all that stuff, all the flashy, cool stuff, all the wonderful historical moments, but the invisible labor that people who have to work on tirelessly to make that stuff accessible and to make sure that we're ably preserving those collections, that is incredibly important, but often we don't hear about it. So this event is not just a collaboration between MOHI, MEPOPs, and the Labor Archives. It is also part of Labor Spring, a nationwide series of events that began in 2023. Labor Spring brings together students, workers, unionists, allies, environmentalists, elected leaders, and more to support workers' organizing efforts. These events anchored on college campuses and in communities aim to bolster workplace justice, racial equity, and the public good. And you'll notice that there's a little banner from them that they mailed to us hung over there. Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the WTO Protest Footage Digitization Project. I'm thrilled to share some exciting news that this project, which Hannah, Jill, and Libby drove forward for years before we stepped in to try to help empower the final push through funding, is ready to launch. Coming soon, we have kind of a three-part thing. I'll hold this up. You can also get a QR code at our table, and this is a link to the new three-part website that we're launching soon. We also have handouts about this WTO Footage Protest Project website. So this is really the culmination of those 4 hours of raw footage. It's going to ensure the digitization, description, and preservation of this critical historical record is available and accessible to the public. The release of this online archive will mark the 25th anniversary exhibit and programs organized by MOHI running from November to March of this year. And this collection, which was donated, as Jill mentioned, and meticulously documented by activist oral historian and filmmaker Jill Freidberg, includes an array of different types of formats. The videos were created by activist journalists embedded within the protest, capturing a pivotal moment in global resistance, community organizing, and media advocacy. Jill has been working on obtaining permissions from all of those videographers that we were able to reach and improving the metadata, which is a crucial step for us being able to manage that and administer the collections and allow people to connect to that information, to that collection as the part of 2 different grants, and then most recently as a final part of a Labor Archives funded completion project to bring that worth to the public. This project will be part of a new 3-part website. So it'll migrate a faculty website by Margaret Levy, that was called the WTO History Project. It'll also create a front end to a UW Libraries digital archives, which has already hundreds of digital versions of things that are already in our collections. And it will also be the WTO Footage Project website. So for the first time, researchers of all different levels of experience are going to be able to go to one place, and they're going to be able to access the lessons about the WTO protests in 1999. It's been a perennial thing that these different resources have been kind of siloed and kept apart, and so putting them together is one of the things that we were very happy to fund. Please stay tuned for updates on this groundbreaking project, which brings the history of resistance and media activism to a global audience. Next, we're going to hear from Libby, co-executive director of the Moving Image Preservation of Puget Sound and project audiovisual archivist at the Seattle Municipal Archives. Libby will provide a detailed overview of the often hidden work that goes into processing and digitizing collections, ensuring that true preservation and access happens. Following Libby's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion featuring Libby, Jill, and myself, where we'll dive deeper into the intricacy of this work. After the panel, there'll be time for a Q&A session. One thing I would ask about the Q&A is we want to hear everybody's story, and there's going to be a storytelling and collection event as part of this series of events. Rather than trading war stories, I would love it if when we ask them questions, we ask Jill and Libby questions that relate to their work, because it's the only time we're going to be able to talk to them in this context. And then we can also tell stories as part of that other larger series of events. In closing, I just want to express my deepest gratitude for the opportunity to be part of this existing and wonderful project. It's been an honor to help fund and bring this project to fruition. So much of the work has already been put into it, and I really thank you all for your attention, support, and commitment to preserving and sharing our shared history. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm much shorter. Hello, like Connor said, I am Libby Hopfauf. I am the executive director and of Moving Image Preservation of Puget Sound, or MEPOPS, and I'm also the audiovisual archivist at the Seattle Municipal Archives. And I'm just really honored to be here today, and MEPOPS is really honored to have been part of this process. And one thing that I wrote down during Jill's presentation that kind of struck me was when the one person was talking and said that IndyMedia is preserving today's history. And that's just that's amazing. And that's something that I think we really need to think about more today. But I also feel like it sort of feeds into this full circle of MEPOPS preserving the past history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that very briefly, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. Moving Image Preservation of Puget Sound is a nonprofit 501c3 corporation, and we were formed to help preserve our cultural heritage by assisting archives, libraries, and other organizations with the conversion of analog video recordings to digital formats according to archival best practices. And sorry, I'm going to try to stick to my notes because sometimes I geek out and I keep talking and talking because I get excited. So this is sort of this is our mission statement. So it's supposed to be pretty straightforward and clear, but I just want to double down on the fact that we work with all these different organizations. We are not an archive. But we work with organizations that have moving images in their collections and help them transfer those into digital files. It seems like there's an echo with this. Okay. Is this better? Okay. Glad it wasn't just me. So in order to be concise, I am going to play a quick video called What is MEPOPS? And it'll just show you guys a little bit of who we are and what we do much faster than I will. As soon as videotape left the factory, it already started to break down. Information that is on the tapes is slowly dying, and if we don't preserve them, important historical content that's contained on them will be lost forever.
What is MEPOPS?
What is MEPOPS?
What is MEPOPS? MEPOPS stands for Moving Image Preservation of Puget Sound.
What MEPOPS does for the general public of the Pacific Northwest is provide access to digitized content.
Our mission is to raise awareness about the magnetic media crisis, the alarm that the Association of Moving Image Archivists sounded to sort of bring awareness to the urgency of digitizing videotape.
Audiovisual Archive in Australia has put a deadline of 2025 to say, if you don't have your magnetic material digitized by this time, you're screwed. They're figuring out the actual date, and it's right around the corner.
Within 20 to 30 years of the time it's created, it's disintegrating.
The magnetic media crisis is sometimes called a gathering storm because the deterioration of the actual analog videotapes and then the increasing obsolescence and rarity of the players that play them back.
So video is a little bit different from film in that video went through all these different iterations, all these different formats for consumer purposes, for broadcast purposes, whereas film, there were consumer formats, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, but the principle of film has stayed pretty consistent. And video requires all these different players.
A lot of the formats that we work with stopped being manufactured years ago. And so we have to make sure that we take good care of them and tune them up, clean them, because a lot of the parts and players are getting harder and harder to come by, and so are the people who actually work on them. They're a dying breed, if you will.
In some cases, people thought they were creating preservation copies by putting film onto videotape. In fact, that was not a great idea. Film is actually quite stable.
The thing about older media types like film and negatives is that they are stable. 30 years from now, you're going to be able to view them.
100-year-old nitrate film, in some cases, is still around and looks gorgeous. Whereas video, for its manufacture, had a completely different purpose. It was more of a kind of democratizing format for shooting.
It was a lot cheaper than film, so not only were professionals using it, but also amateurs and just the average person was able to buy videotape and record.
There was plenty of access. You could watch your VHS tape of a film, but now that VHS tape needs a lot of help. We have to keep up. We can't just sort of settle back and say, okay, we're finished. Despite the fact that we're working with old materials that have their fixed content, the way we view that material, the way we store that material is going to just keep changing and evolving.
A lot of the time, videotape is capturing real people doing real things. That might sound personal and boring, but it really encompasses so much of Seattle and Seattle's history that it's valuable to the general public and great for them to be able to access it. The public is able to see files digitized at MePops on Internet Archive, where we create collections for each group so that they can, based on that institution, go in and view the content on their personal computer. Thank you. Thank you so much. So as our previous executive director and a member of our advisory board and I discussed in that video, one of the many reasons that MePops is really passionate about magnetic media is that it was democratizing. All these people were able to purchase this cheaper, easier to carry around, more portable format, and they were able to afford the equipment and the supplies to keep that going, which made it more sustainable. And it enabled anyone to record their own history in their own voices. And this increased the urgency to preserve these degrading materials. I'm so sorry, I don't know why that's echoing. Can everyone hear me? I'm just gonna step, okay, all right, great, sorry. I don't know what to do about that. Oh no, okay, sorry, all right, okay, no. Okay, okay. So yeah, the magnetic media is breaking down, and because so many different diverse groups were able to record using this format, that increases the urgency for them to preserve, or for us to help them preserve these at-risk materials, so that we can save all of these stories from underrepresented groups that are traditionally underrepresented in historical records. But over the past 10 years, MePops has partnered with over 40 local archives, museums, historical societies, libraries, heritage organizations, as well as local artists, filmmakers, and arts organizations to preserve their collections. And to date, we've helped facilitate the capture and preservation of over 8,000 videotapes containing over 12,000 hours of content, including all of these groups on this slide. So our main service is that we provide hands-on training in all aspects of archival processing for videotapes. Within our model, each institution provides a representative, either an employee or a volunteer, to be trained by MEPOPs in analog to digital transfers. That is, capturing the content from a physical videotape to a digital file. And that enables each organization to preserve and provide access to their moving image materials and furthers MEPOP's broader goal of education about magnetic media preservation. And this just makes our model a little bit more sustainable because a growing number of archivists are empowered to care for their own audiovisual records. Our workflow is specifically designed and maintained to utilize as many open source tools as possible to ensure low cost, customable and sustainable AV preservation that adheres to best practices but is attainable for underfunded organizations, which is most of the organizations that we work with. As you saw in the video, public access to digitized content is provided through MEPOP's official Internet Archive collection, and that's a library of videotapes that have been digitized at MEPOPs by the housing repositories. As a quick note, we do not deal with any of the internal cataloging or metadata or indexing or describing of the related materials. We receive that information from the organizations that we work with. I noticed as that video was playing that the University of Washington had a collection, and they did with us at one point, but because they have so many files, they ended up moving it to their own Internet Archive collection. And we were able to convince one of the guys at Internet Archive to just scooch it over as opposed to them having to re-upload their materials. In addition to hands-on training, we create and maintain and contribute to open source tools and training materials for archivists that address a variety of learning styles and skill levels. This documentation is publicly available online and in-house for participating institutions to use as a reference for all procedures in the digitizing process. We also host and facilitate a number of different educational opportunities, including AV 101, which is a series of workshops that we put together to bring in archivists and sometimes even community members to teach them how to care for their videotape materials and audio tape and film as well. And then we also, as a nonprofit, we mostly work with other nonprofits, but every year in October, we get the opportunity to work with the general public through Home Movie Day, and we've recently, in the last few years, partnered with KCLS to do this. And as part of every project that we have with the organizations we work with, we offer them an opportunity to work with us to promote access to the video that they've just digitized with us in-house. We have had a series running at the Northwest Film Forum since 2016 called Moving History, and we use that as either we have a showcase of all the different organizations we've worked with and we find a theme to present all these different materials, or we work with a single group to present a showcase of the collection that they've just worked to preserve. We do not house our own archival materials, like I said previously, but we do provide long-term storage for some organizations. Video files are really big and storage is really expensive. One of the exceptions to this is the University of Washington because they have a very robust long-term digital preservation system. But for organizations that can't afford it, we do provide that option for them, and then we maintain those backup copies to ensure that their materials are preserved into the foreseeable future. So a little bit about this project. It started out, as you saw, with all of these filmmakers on the ground preserving these capturing these materials with their camcorders, and then all of those materials were then at the Independent Media Center. Jill eventually took custody of them and preserved them very well, I have to say too. Like, I've seen videotapes that were stored in people's basements and attics and they were not in great shape. The tapes that Jill brought in were in amazing shape. She did a really, really good job taking care of this collection. And she approached our previous executive director and proposed that we do a pilot project through 4Culture. And 4Culture ended up funding us to do about digitize 40 videotapes for this project out of the 400 plus tapes that are in the collection. And that happened at MePops. And then through all of the work that Jill and Hannah Palin did, the collection moved to the University of Washington. Hannah was able to write a grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources, or CLEAR, and get funding secured so that the rest of the collection would be digitized. At this point, it was 2020. So Hannah had that collection in boxes, and then it came to MePops. We were all wearing masks, and like some of it was done remotely as could be, but we were all really dedicated to making sure that we met the deadlines and that we got these materials preserved. And then MePops, in turn, delivered all of the files to the University of Washington, where they are now preserved long-term. And I just have a couple photos to show you, just so you get an idea. This is my previous coworker, Ari Levine, and myself, and this is one of the first days that Jill came in with her tapes, and we started looking at all of them and seeing like what condition they were in. And the face Ari is making is like, we were just really excited by how well preserved they had been from being under Jill's stairs. And another thing too that like doesn't often happen in this process when we work with other organizations, a lot of the time there's a lot of guesswork that goes into it as well as research. So we're trying to figure out what is this tape? What's on this tape? Who are these people? What's happening? But because Jill was there, she was able to watch these tapes, and she knew all the names, she knew the streets that they were on, all of the businesses that were in the surrounding area. Like, it was like just an archivist dream to have all of that information immediately available, and because we knew that would make it so much more accessible later. So this is Jill in the MePops office watching the footage. And just really quick, this is the process that MePops has. So we an organization brings in their tapes, we walk them through identifying what formats they have. Jill didn't really need that help. And then figuring out, do they need repairs, or is there anything wrong with the tape that needs to be resolved prior to playback? And then we make sure all the adjustments are made on the equipment that we have so that the image looks like it did back in the day. It's transferred from the videotape to our computer, and then we, in a preservation level quality video, and then we make an access copy, we back that up, and then we either deliver it to the organization or put it online, or both. And then I just have a couple more photos. So the culmination of that project was we helped put together a screening at the Northwest Film Forum on, I think it was N30 2019. And then there was also this really great event that Jill did projecting the footage downtown. So those are some images of that. Another one. This is the audience at the screening. It looks like my dad's asleep in this picture, I just realized that. He was very excited, though, to watch this footage. It was a great screening. And the Recordings at Risk is, like, I just wanted to give a shout out to them because that's the grant that Hannah secured that allowed us to preserve these materials. And then this is a picture of Jill, and I think this other one is at UW, so it's just the tapes being moved from Jill's house to the University of Washington. And then, so some of the videotape formats there, like, I mean, tapes were dropped and they were copied, like, everyone was working really, really fast. But, and so, like, also this format, DV, has a lot of different problems, but we were able to work with different software to make sure that it was preserved and is represented the way that it was actually recorded, which was really exciting for us. Oh, and this is just another representation of like some of the things that we looked through to try to make sure that it was actually preserved properly. And that's all for me. Like, MePops is very, very grateful to have been part of this project. This is a huge part of our mission, preserving these materials, and we've been glad to be involved, so thank you.
Okay, so I think there's been a suggestion that we go straight to Q&A since we've documented our process pretty well. So if y'all want to start asking questions, especially of Libby and Jill, we'll be able to hear it right from the source and the custodian and the creator and the steward. So
somebody has mics? Yeah, there's a mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. Jill, it's great to see you, especially in your work. I can hear a lot of successes, like in particular, I was like, oh my gosh, 20 years under your stairs, and then to hear how well they were preserved, it feels like those are really great successes. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about near misses, places where this could have gone wrong and we could have lost these archives, just to share more about how important this process is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the tapes coming to my house, but I know they did. But after the WTO, we had the basement of the Teamsters Hall for a week where we sort of like it was just bins full of random tapes where we managed to sort of do a first pass of like organizing them and logging them, which I think was important because if we hadn't done that, they really were just sort of like, I don't know if anybody would have had it in them to bring those home in a manageable way. And then not long after that, I approached University of Washington because a lot of these tapes were beta SP, like each tape is big. It was a lot of space in my house. I really didn't, could have used that space for other things, but it was, I mean, there was just, and especially now seeing how much it has taken to actually get it done, there was no way in 2000, 2001 that the technology or the capacity existed to do it at that point. Yeah, that's a beta SP, big visual aid. So, but they did keep them at UW for quite a while, and they were in a closet. And I remember there was this whole period of time where I would wake up in a cold sweat because if you hear these stories about how, somebody found Einstein's diaries in a closet, and I always wondered, like, how did they get there? And then I thought, oh my God, I'm not gonna know what closet they're in, and they're just gonna be like in some hallway in the basement of Suzzallo, and you'll never see them again. So that felt not like it felt. I don't think it was a near miss, but it felt like one. And I'm surprised that they were in as good a shape as they were because they did spend some time in a unclimate-controlled garage, quite a while, in the cold and the damp. But I mean, I don't know. That's about it. They just went under my stairs and they stayed there. So I mean, I guess if something had happened to my house, that would have been terrible. But that's it. They just stayed there. I was really glad when Hannah came to pick them up. Hannah's right there. By the way, Hannah's in the front row.
I think that's also an opportunity to think about kind of the ethics of care, because I remember after I started, a couple years after I started my job at the Labor Archives in late 2010, Jill reached out to me because these things were already at the University of Washington. But I had to be real about our current capacity at the time in terms of what we were able to do. And so I think it's really important for repositories to be able to be honest about what their capacity is and how they can do right by it, because we could have done a job, but it wouldn't have been the greatest job at that time. So it really took somebody like Hannah who understood the materials, had the wherewithal, the capacity, and also the ability to partner with MEPOPs and have funding to be able to actually drive a project forward, because I could have tried to do it, it wouldn't have been a good job, and then all these well-preserved tapes would have had inferior copies, and so I think these are all considerations, but you don't often have a person who is a combination between the creator, like Jill, who has all the information about the thing that they've created, and then also is a tireless advocate and has a sense of the historicity of the thing that they've created and how valuable it is. Like, Jill is a tireless advocate for those materials and always knew that they were historically records of enduring value, right? And so you don't always have that wonderful combination all at the same time. And I think one thing I love about this project is it's a story about all these different pieces coming together in collaboration in a way that's a great example of how you could do right by collections, but it's all, any one of those pieces that didn't come together could have been a weak point, and it's where I think we need to all think about in terms of AV materials, but also in terms of archival collections and preservation, because sometimes we take things out of a community context, but we have to promise that we're going to do better by them than taking them out of this community of creation, right?
Thanks so much for all this work. It's very inspiring. And generally speaking, I'm moved to say thanks for all of the very careful protection of this stuff. I think it's an example of the heroism of librarians and archivists and preservationists, because we can see in the content of this stuff how absolutely important part of history it is, and it gets lost if it's not for the work of folks like we have in front of us right now. So thank you so much for all that work. I've got a particular question for Libby about the Internet Archive, because when you were doing your first video, I saw, oh, the interface looks like the Internet Archive, and so you said, yeah, that you're using that project to house a lot of that stuff. I would like to know if you're using the Internet Archive to actually maintain like the highest quality archival copies of things, or is it just mostly for distribution? And the other thing I'll say about the Internet Archive, which is a fantastic project, maybe you'll say something more about it, is that like IndyMedia, it's kind of an open publishing model where it's not just an organization, but anybody can start using the Internet Archive to archive their own stuff or stuff they've collected or want to preserve, and it's kind of an astonishing, slightly secret project that everyone should know about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we do not use Internet Archive for long-term digital preservation. We use a system called Linear Open 1 or LTO tapes. And those are, I won't geek out and get too into detail about it, but they are, because a lot of people are like, why do you take a tape off, like media off a tape and put it on another tape? It's not hackable. Like it's contained in a tape. You have to have very special equipment to use it. It's also cheaper. So that's what we chose to do for long-term digital preservation. We use Internet Archive as purely an access platform. And organizations are able to determine whether or not they want things to be stream only, which does not really fit in the Internet Archive model. I've had a couple stern conversations with people where I've had to make the argument that isn't it better to have some access than no access at all? We don't use it for distribution. Early on when we were working with these groups, we realized that they had so many other needs. It wasn't just that they needed equipment and they needed to be able to view their materials. They needed help with all of these things because it was increasing in cost. So, I mean, it's expensive to have a access platform. And so, like you said, Internet Archive really provided us with this cost-efficient opportunity. And I mean, with anything that's open source, it's sort of like the free beer versus free kittens argument, where it's like, it requires a lot of maintenance on our end, but we're willing to put that in because we have the capacity to. And for us, it's more important to help these organizations provide access to their materials in the way that they would like them to be displayed, I suppose. But yeah, I think you're right, Internet Archive is a great resource.
Yeah, and that's actually how we're going to deliver our piece of the project. Yuli has been working tirelessly to make sure that we're also transferring all the metadata Jill worked on. And so we will have the streaming only model that will feed the front end of the website, and that's where you'll get access. But people can also discover it kind of in the wild by just browsing the Internet Archive as well.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for all the amazing work you're doing and being involved in this. I have a question that's not really about archiving, but maybe a bit tangential, so feel free to skip it if it doesn't fit this event. But something you touched in the keynote is about kind of like moderation and self-publishing. And that's something that I've been kind of butting against in the modern kind of news ecosystem, where people are getting news from so many different sources, it becomes really difficult to talk about things. Like in the past, we had like those few consolidated news channels. So when there was misinformation, there was like 1 or 2 sources you were debunking. But now there's like 10, 20 micro influencers. I don't know if you've heard the statistic that like, I think something like 42% of people get their news from TikTok. I think that's just for America. So, and I've bought into this in real life when I'm talking to someone about an issue and they just cite TikToks. And it also creates this network effect, because when you have like 10, 20 different micro-influencers talking about the same issue, they reshare each other, they re-quote each other, it creates this illusion that it's so much more true because there's so many people who have this opinion, but they're all just sharing each other. So I almost feel like we traded like few really big echo chambers into like thousands of tiny echo chambers. And I don't know if you have, I don't think that, there's a clear solution. So it's maybe less question, just like your thoughts and observations, like how do we navigate that, like this kind of ecosystem, how do, any thoughts you might have on that? Thank you.
I mean, I just think for either of the media landscapes you described, that the absence of media literacy is the problem. Like if you understand how the importance of analyzing the information you're receiving and discovering sources that are consistent and reliable and expanding your sort of reach for sources and understanding how to like look behind a source to see if it's actually a legitimate source of information and who owns it and who pays for it and who's benefiting from it. Without that media literacy, you could have 200 micro influencers or 3 media monopolies. If you're just consuming the information and don't have any literacy around how to consume it, then it can be, it creates situations like the one that we're in. So I feel like efforts to increase people's media literacy, especially at the like K through 12 level, but also in the higher ed level, to just increase people's media literacy is like basic media literacy is really important and more fraught now with social media than it was prior to that, but not any less necessary. I don't know. That's all I got.
So I want to thank you for saving this phenomenal part of the history of Seattle and also explaining more about IndyMedia. I think that was a really important part. I was an investigator at Public Defense during this period. I couldn't participate because I might be, meeting people in jail that I needed to help represent. But it was really wonderful to learn that you all were taking inspiration outside of the main media sources.
Thanks for being there for people who were ending up in jail, too.
Hello. I had a question sort of regarding the, dealing with maybe like private information or personal information with these archives, just because they are, recent in the last 30 years, and was there, especially because these are people you personally know, how you navigated digitizing that, but maybe either redacting or omitting, or maybe that's something that didn't actually have to come up. But yeah, does that kind of make sense? Like, almost like, oh, that person's maybe like personal information or address that still they might live at today in the archives.
I mean, I think in relationship to this archive in particular, we did have some conversations about footage of people breaking the law and whether or not 20 to 25 years later, that was still a concern or an issue. But I don't think in the end we came across anything in the collection that we felt was really specifically could be a problem for any individuals. I mean, in general, the protests were very public, and there were like dozens of cameras at every intersection. But I don't think we came across anything that contained people's personal or private information, like an address or a birth date, or really specific identifiable footage of people breaking the law. But we did talk about it, like what if we come across footage? And then also, it was shot by so many different people. In going back to the videographers, which I was telling Susan earlier, I think that was like the highlight was to discovering my sleuthing skills, that I tracked these people down based on like a name and AOL.com email address from 1999. But that they had a say in whether or not, like, they signed deeds of gift saying, you know, I don't want it on the internet, I just want it inside special collections, or do whatever you want with it, and sort of everything in between. So they were also allowed to have some say in whether they thought their footage contained material that shouldn't just be out there in the world. But I don't, in general, that question, I don't know if you probably run into that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this one was definitely one of the first collections where, like, we had a conversation about it, and it should have been something that came into my mind right away, but it wasn't. Like, I was just like, we have to save this, and then I was like, oh yeah, we need to have like an ethical conversation about what we're gonna do here. And from MePop's perspective, like, as soon as material comes into the office, it's like, we don't, occasionally someone will have assigned DNA, but we sort of just, as a policy, don't, like, let people know what's going on with the material we have. So there could be anything on there, and it's kind of like a therapist. Like, unless it's going to cause me harm or someone else direct harm, I'm not going to say anything about it because it's not my material. And in this case, I mean, I guess you could say the police were maybe in that boat, but like Jill said, it's been so long that, but it wasn't up to us, and we wanted to respect the decision that Jill made and the decisions that the University of Washington wanted to make. So that's really what it comes down to.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Connor?
This is such a stunning amount of work and an amazing project, an amazing offering. When it's fully released in its online form, is it searchable? Like, are there ways, are there tags or something that make the content searchable?
Jill created, not to jump in, but Jill created an amazing finding aid. Like I said, there are street corners on there, there are businesses, there's everyone's names, there's organizations. I've actually used it a few different times to search and find things that people thought Seattle Municipal Archives had, and I was like, oh, we don't, but it's in this collection. So there's that resource.
I mean, through my filter. I mean, I would see people, like, I don't know how many people saw Artist the Spoon Man in there, but there's other people in there that I didn't know, whose names didn't end up in the finding aid. I mean, there were definitely times where I would take a screenshot and, you know, text it to Jonathan Rosenblum if they were a labor person, or Heather Day if they were a farmer, and be like, do you know this person's name? And, you know, oftentimes they did. But there's a whole bunch of people in there whose names are in the finding aid because I knew them, and people's who aren't because I didn't. So, you know, it was a little, you know, filtered.
One thing we always try to do is to allow, we think of the first draft of the finding aid as the current present one, and that's an iterative process. So for photo collections, for the records collections, or the archival records or print organizational records, or you know, footage, it can always be improved. And if you see people you know, or there's ways we can enhance description, we try to defer to the people of the community of creation. You know, every step away from the community of creators is one opportunity to lose the information about that shared community knowledge. So we some of our events are about inviting people back to look at our collections, engage in redescription, and to try to make sure that lands in the finding aids or the film archive. So that might be an idea for a future event.
That would be fun.
Hi, thanks for being here this evening. This is a fascinating presentation. And by the way, I only recently abandoned my AOL email address. But Jill, I have a question for you that's kind of off the wall, requires you to use your imagination. How do you imagine that the news media, both the mainstream media and the independent news media, would have covered the WTO protests in Seattle had they happened today, during the time of a fully built out internet and social media and all that other kind of thing?
I mean, anybody in this room could speculate. I mean, I think we've seen smaller scale examples of that. I mean, they're definitely, from the WTO onward, was a sort of exponential increase in the number of cameras that were present at protests, which for a while was a good thing. And then there was sort of a plateau where it felt like there were more people filming than there were protesting. And then, and I'm literally, I feel like there were times where it was like, everybody here has a camera. And then I feel like there was then the next phase of that was, you know, a little bit of this sort of selfie opportunity, like that fine line between documenting something and sort of curating your own sort of digital presence through an experience. But so I don't know. I mean, it kind of makes my head spin with your question. I mean, I just think there would be so many versions of what was happening, both through all of the you know, commercial media that has sprung up because they can do so on the internet, and then all of the influencers and all of the substackers, and I think it would be mind-boggling in a good and bad way. And I mean, that's not very imaginative, but I think anybody in this room could probably answer that question with some sort of version of, yeah, I don't know. I just think it would be, I mean, I don't know if it would happen the way it happened, because I feel like there's, I mean, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but I do feel like there's a really big speed bump in the practice of, you know, using social media to organize protests, which is a really like a short attention span activity, right? That like the WTO protests happened because people specifically for the protests organized for months, but the organizations that came were organizations in many cases that had been doing grassroots organizing for decades and were able to get, you know, tens, hundreds, thousands of people to show up. They didn't post it on Instagram and 80,000 people came to the streets of Seattle. And so I do think there's a little bit of a, that's actually a really great thing about this archive is, you know, the documentaries are like, woo, you know, in the streets and coalitions, but the footage is a lot of the boring part. Like there's people who filmed the boring stuff too that was really critical to it happening. And it never would have happened if it was just a bunch of Instagram posts and, you know, social media, everybody show up. But had it happened, I think it would have, I think it would have just been a soup of coverage, which I guess, you know, could be good and bad. I don't know.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one, and then we'll close out for the night.
Kind of microphone phobic, sorry.
But I can't hear you, so you'll have to.
Jill, you were there during it all also? I don't know. how did the media coverage, just like down in the Indy office, change after tear gas went flying? I mean, it's just all hell broke loose and people ran out the building to cover stuff, and were you down there? Were you out? Probably marching anyway, but.
You mean, how did the IndyMedia coverage change?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just from Como saying we're not going to do this or that, it's like, did people's kind of mindset change for coverage? Film, or I don't know.
But there was not a notable change in the commercial media, like the local networks, Como, King, Cairo,
right?
Totally kept. Yeah, but in terms of independent media, I mean, the night of the first SmackDown, the riot police blocked the doors of the Independent Media Center while there were 200 or 300 people inside, and tear gas was getting in through the door. There were some concerns that the space was going to be raided, and I think, and the footage from that moment, you know, there was a lot of indignation and some surprise. Like, there were definitely people who thought how could such a thing happen? And then there were plenty of people who thought, of course this is happening. So I think maybe the coverage was just that people realized, that the stakes were higher, and that it was going to be important to not just continue covering what was happening, but also keep an eye on the police response. Maybe be a little bit more vigilant about that. I was not in that space. We had a separate little house that doesn't exist anymore that was part of a church property in Lower Queen Anne. I don't even remember the church, but it was like a really cute little yellow house, and all of the video collectives were in there, and that all of the footage ended up there. But every time it looked like the downtown Independent Media Center was getting raided, there was more than one occasion where we threw all of the tapes in bins and ran out the door, and people were like running up Queen Anne Hill in the dark with these giant, you know, bins full of videotapes, thinking that. And the main Independent Media Center was at 3rd and Union, right next to Bruno's Pizza, between Bruno's and Wild Ginger. But the little house was in Lower Queen Anne. So I didn't witness that night, but I do think people just got a little bit more serious about the things that they would need to be documenting.
One cool thing, too, that was in this collection was members of the Independent Media Center were recording 24 hours every single local news channel. And that was interesting, and that was like something when we came across it later, because we repack tapes, figure out how long they are, and I was like, whew, 6 hours, I'm gonna do this tape last. But when we started coming across it, I was like, well, this is copyrighted, and then it was like obviously a really clear, well done scrapbook, basically, of like how every single different news outlet had covered this, which was just amazing foresight, I thought, on your guys' part, because it was fascinating to watch how it didn't change that much, but it was interesting to see like the different things that they said.
I'm pretty sure that was, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, you might know the answer to this, but I'm pretty sure that was Mike McCormick did that, just sat home and recorded all the channels all day, 24 hours a day for 5, 6, 7 days. I'm pretty sure it was one person who just did that all. I could be wrong, but pretty sure that was his role. So everybody had their role.
It's just a really, I don't know, I thought it was an interesting comparison.
Yeah.
Well, I think if there are more questions, you can see if.
Could we hear what Hannah like shepherded the whole project?
Great. Could someone bring a microphone then?
But with the mic, because there's a captioner and.
Ooh, that's loud. So, Jill, who did in the end of your presentation, there was the compilation reel, essentially. Did you do that? I've seen it. And I was like, wow, where did that come from? In your
Oh,
presentation?
That's a lot of the footage that we, projected onto the convention center in 2019 at the 20th anniversary.
Did we show it at Northwest Film Forum?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
It
I
was-
was having
I
a
mean-
weird flashback.
Yeah, so
I was
we used the For Culture money to digitize like 40 hours, and then we pulled highlights out of that and used that to convince the Clear grant
Right.
that they should give us money to finish. So
Okay.
you've seen that footage before.
No wonder. It's just
Yeah.
been a few years. So,
But Jill did edit it.
yes,
very, very
I was
well.
like,
Yeah.
I know I didn't do it, but then I thought maybe I'm having a brain snap. So anyway, it was wonderful. It was great to see again. So thank you. This made me very nostalgic, and I was very happy to see that all of the work that we all did came to fruition and is out there in the world. It's just the whole reason we do this work. Me too. So, yay!
Yes, round of applause for all of our speakers and for the project in general.